What's up? Everyone. So I was just thinking when she said you guys have known each other. So we've known each other 16 years, right? I met you during Extreme Labs. So people may not know that Chamath was the biggest investor in Extreme Labs. Met him in 2009 when he was at Facebook, and we were actually working on a lot of the Facebook properties at the same time.
That's right.
So welcome. And I want to actually talk about some things maybe people don't know about Chamath. One thing that I wanted to start off with is that you see this very polished individual.
I'm government adjacent now, so I have to dress in a suit.
It's a dress, yeah. My wife said, please don't be underdressed, and you can tell I'm not underdressed. But very polished. But one thing that reminds me of you being a learning machine is anytime you go and you do something, and if I'm around, you'll always come out after and be like, how was that? So tell me about this learning instinct. I think even when you write those annual reports, sometimes I send you, hey, here's a few, and you're like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? You're very much into the getting feedback. Where did that come from? What is the ethos behind that?
Well, I think that was a learned thing at Facebook. And the reason was because the original cohort of people at Facebook were all from Ivy League schools. And there is just a perception from a graduate of an Ivy League school that is different than those of us who did not go to the Ivy Leagues. And part of it is just this conditioning where I don't think it's true now anymore because I don't think it's that much of a thing to go to the Ivies anymore. I mean, I think that the smartest generation of kids are either not going to college or, would never go to Harvard. But that generation, the smartest kids, quote unquote, did go. And so they graduated being told that they were geniuses. They were able to do all these things, right? And so at the company, there was just this established perspective that they always knew the answer. And I just found them to be some of the dumbest people I worked with. And so part of it was just I learned, to start to elicit feedback because it started to force people to think, and then they would eventually. Charlie Munger has this great quote, which is, even the shittiest person, if you surround them with a good person, eventually becomes a pretty good person. And so even a bad behavior, if you surround them with enough good behaviors, you co-opt and you start to become good. So we had all of these kids who thought they were geniuses, and this whole process of getting feedback initially started almost as a lark so that they would start to copy it, but then it just became a thing, and then my whole organization just became so wrapped up in it. And then we started to see such enormous enterprise gains by not asking people how they felt about things. I feel this. Shut the fuck up. Who cares? You feel. What is it? What does it mean? What is the answer? And we were richly rewarded for being unemotional and getting feedback. And so I felt it on my skin that you're better off just asking, always asking, constantly asking.
Anybody, right? Not just people who
Everybody. I ask everybody. And by the way, I model it. So what's weird is then later, I see some of the most incredible entrepreneurs of our generation, and I would put Elon at the top of the list. He is constantly asking. Constantly. And he's always just surrounded by extremely technical people, and he's always constantly asking. And so, it's kind of if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. You know what I mean?
But it's surprising because I've seen you do this. Even today, you yelled out your email address because you're tell me something I don't know. Teach me.
Well, there's all these people that you can learn from, and the problem is that the more I don't know. I hate to say this way, but the more success that you can have, the easier it is to detach yourself from real life, and then you start to miss out on people. And if you think about the people that have the great ideas, it's the people without nostalgia, and it's people without a bias. And those people tend to be one of two kinds: young people that have nothing else going for them, or people that are transitioning to something totally different, from career 1 to career 2. So they have no priors, right? So people with no priors have zero risk of embarrassment. And so I get approached by a lot of people. So I'm yeah, it's just chamath@gmail.com. What have I got to lose? I lose nothing. Absolutely nothing. I get hundreds of emails probably a week in my inbox. I've learned more, and I've avoided potholes through those people than anything. Because by the time you get in front of me, everybody's so well packaged. It's just I don't know. I just think this other path is a better path.
Yeah.
Always ask for feedback. You lose nothing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think it's very different than the persona people think about you as somebody who's like, as soon as you come off stage, you're like, what do you think of that? Like, what could I have done better? It's not, doesn't seem like what you would expect. So I think it's very endearing.
Well, thank you.
On that same train, you talked about Facebook, and people probably obviously forget because you're now running your own show in many places that you were an executive, and you worked in an executive team. So tell us a little bit about that. Like, what was about some of the people? What do you think makes a good executive team? Because I learned a lot from you in the Extreme Lab days when you were telling us about how Facebook would run their, I think it was M Team, and how they ran the meetings, and you're like, here's how many slides. Like, we would present all these slides, and you're like, you clearly don't know what to present to me because you're showing me 30 slides.
Well, 30 slides means you don't know jack shit.
Right. I think you said something like Zuck would only take 3 slides or 5 slides.
No, I don't think he ever had that rule, but like what I've seen is that, if people can't boil, like I once had a meeting with Bezos, and I walked into that meeting with him and his S team, and I wrote a 7-pager. And it's incredibly, like they sat there with their pencils and they just like, they read them, and you're just sitting there like it's like an exam, and they're just like, what are they thinking? And they're just like writing things down on the margins and stuff. So I've seen that style. I did it in respect of the Amazon S team when I was with them for something. I don't think it works, frankly, for me. I like the exact other extreme, which is like a 1-pager, which forces such a level of mental clarity. But back to the original question, the M team at Facebook worked because we had a very confrontational culture. Most of that was me, and we had a very permissive acceptance of it, and that was entirely Mark. And so Mark wanted to see people intellectually battling, and then he was kind of picking pieces of each argument, and then he was implementing the superior approach. And at least at that time, the personalities we had, the confrontation just created better outcomes. We were able to navigate and make technical decisions that were just better. And when there were really philosophical decisions, we didn't get caught up in the bullshit. I told this like once, like I've told this story again, I can say it, but like I remember that Dustin and I had a huge falling out in this moment where I was like, we're gonna do the following decisions. And he was like, well, we were fighting over like whether a box was like opt-in or opt-out, right? Like at the end, like you can develop all the greatest technology in the world, it boils down to an opt-in or opt-out. And I was like, fuck that, it's opt-out. And he's like, it can't be, this is not the philosophy of the internet. And I'm like, fuck the philosophy of the internet, we're gonna win. And winning means this thing needs to be opt-out. And I remember just like battling, and the decision was ultimately opt-out, and it was an enormously important decision in the history of our business. And so he created, I think Mark created a culture where you could really fight, and it turned out that I liked fighting. I loved it. I still love it to this day. I will pick any topic, I'll take any side, I'll just debate it. And you get, I think, at least from me and my personality and the way my mind works, the decisions that I've had to make, it's helped, and it's allowed me to see things, I would say like a few seconds before many other people, and that's been transformational for my life.
Yeah, there's something about even your personality where you say you like fighting, but also this aggression, right? Assertiveness. And I used to think that, we talk about Canada versus US, right? You're a Canadian, well, you lived here, you're Canadian, and...
Still a Canadian.
Still Canadian, okay, great.
Yeah.
And now American.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we saw at Extreme Labs was the whole exec team there were people who had worked in the US, but then came back to Canada. And so one of the hypotheses was that we kind of learned, or maybe I learned part of my assertiveness from working in the US. Do you think that's part of where you got that from, or were you always that way?
Yeah, I think America has an incredible culture of assertiveness, and it's incredible the perspective of seeing it through the eyes of an immigrant. I'll tell you this great story. There's a kid who started at Stanford 2 years ago. My wife's Italian, and so I have a lot of Italian friends, and one of them, this family, wonderful father and mother who've raised 3 incredible kids in a suburb of Milan and sent them all to incredible schools in America. But they all tracked into finance except the youngest kid, came to Stanford, and so, he comes over to the house, we feed him, typical, Italian thing, whatever. And he's done extremely well at the IMO, International Mathematics Olympiad. He's been working a lot at the compiler level of AI, which was originally how I started 8090, actually, was to build a transpiler. Anyways, which didn't work, and we pivoted, but... So I was talking to him, and he now has a huge job at an extremely well-known, very valuable startup for the summer. And I was shocked. I was like, so how much are they paying you? He's like, $400K prorated for the summer. And I was like, what, as an intern?
Insane.
And I said, how did you get that? He said, I realized that everybody here in America is so super assertive, and they just present themselves as experts. And eventually I realized, hold on a second, I know just as much as these guys, except the difference is I'm keeping my mouth shut and they're saying it. And so he taught himself to just stand up for himself and to be his best advocate. Fast forward, a year later, he's working at this startup and he's doing these incredible things. It's just a very simple example of illustrating America has this way of attracting people and showing a set of valued behaviors, or maybe not valued, but rewarded behaviors. And it doesn't exist in any other country. And so, in Canada, my fate would have been to be buried in a hierarchy. In America, I can make the hierarchy, And so it's a big cultural difference. And it's worth copying. That part of the United States is absolutely worth copying.
Yeah, I think I came to a similar conclusion, but differently. It wasn't that I felt like myself going as a Canadian moving to Texas that I should just talk more. It was that I moved to 98. I think you moved in 99.
99, yeah.
99, so I moved in 98. I get to this company called Trilogy. They go, where'd you go to school? I say Waterloo. They say, what's Waterloo? That's literally what it was back when we were in...
Same at Facebook, when I started recruiting for Facebook, the co-ops, they were like, what's a co-op program? Where's Waterloo? Right. And now I think Meta's like one of the largest recruiters at that school.
Yeah, same with us, right? And one of the things that happened to me was I said, where'd you go to school? And the guy said, it was my roommate. He said, Stanford. I said, what's Stanford? As a joke, right? But what happened was I realized in working with these people, right? I had the number one, I had this guy Walter who was a number one grad from MIT to my left. I had Razvan to my right, number one grad from Harvard, right? Both CS. One of them worked for played on the 21 movie, the poker team that beat Vegas. He on that team, and I could keep up with them. And I was like, wait a sec, we're just as
that's a crazy moment when you realize you can keep up.
Right, and then you can turn it around and be like, well, I can be as assertive as they are, and that turns into the hey. Well,
I think that's the cultural thing. Like Canada gave me a lot. I think the chip on my shoulder that it gave me was very valuable. I think the baggage that it gave me was to keep my head down, and I've had to untrain myself to poke my head up. And then now I've probably taken it to the extreme where it's much easier to just be out there. It's actually easier, because then there's no decision load for when to keep your head up and when to put your head down. You know what I mean?
I agree. And I think, so going back to this learning train, you got back in the game with 8090, right?
I've been starting businesses since 2015 because Social Capital was an investment business, which is not really a business. It's just me putting money to work.
Can I quote you from what you told me about Social Capital?
Yeah.
You said, if I only do this, I'm going to be as dumb as any other VC in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the first 5 years were really fun. I think I learned a lot. I think that I proved there was a chapter in my life where I thought I wanted to be an investor. But then really what I realized was I could be numerically excellent by not having to run around every 2 years and raise money from LPs and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's anything that it's cracked up to be. It's an extremely critical function in the economy, but it wasn't for me. And so, 2016, I was able to convince this guy, Jonathan Ross, to leave Google, and he was the father of the TPU, and we started this company called Grok. And that started this path, frankly, where I stumbled into AI accidentally in 2016, building this chip, taping this chip out, trying to build an inference market where it didn't really exist. Our first customers were like in high-frequency trading and all of this other stuff. Then it was like, trying to sell to defense. It was a go-nowhere business until ChatGPT launched, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this is real. And what happened in that process was I was able to build the courage to start a bunch of other things. Started an energy business, started a battery business, started a rare earths business. And these are all not things that are particularly that interesting in the realm of technology in the classical sense. But then 80/90 is this like next stack that fits into this little idea that I have about, I mentioned it this morning. There's like if you take the OSI stack for the internet, I think you will be able to map in 20 and 30 years all of the value that's created in AI through the same lens. And so that stack basically is a very good reference framework for understanding like what has to be built on top of itself. And working at the silicon layer early on was really insightful for what is going to happen in AI. And because AI is forking, there's two major forks. One is towards physical AI and one is towards software. And so that's how I've kind of like pieced all this stuff together.
And what did you see in Jonathan that made you, like, obviously, I mean, he did you say, hey, I made the TPU, I want to do a thing, or did
that was it. No. Sundar, because I called Sundar and I was like, hey, I heard this thing in an earnings release. What the hell is this chip you're talking about? I didn't know that you could, you had gone through like a whole process, and like, where did you get the courage to even think that that was possible? And he's like, go talk to Jonathan. And then I talked to Jonathan, and I was like, my God, like I didn't realize that this was happening. And so I was sleeping on the whole thing. Now, at the time, Google's first foray had nothing to do with transformers at all. It was tensors. Yeah. And there was this thing called TensorFlow, and so I was like, this is a really big deal if they're using this with such advantage. And so for Jonathan, it was an opportunity for him to just kind of like build a business. Going back to the first comment, this is a guy that did not graduate from high school, grew up somewhere in the middle of fucking Oklahoma, ended up getting a job at a high-frequency trading firm. I don't know how he did, but he was so good. Then he goes to NYU, still drops out, then gets recruited by Google and ends up building TPU. There are like a ton of these guys.
I work for a high school dropout.
Huh?
Toby's
a high school dropout?
Yep.
Oh, there you go.
Right, pretty crazy.
How great is that?
It's amazing. I mean, so that's an interesting one. You found Jonathan, but what is your filter? Like, you find great people. Like, what are you looking for?
No, not anymore. I kind of like do one or two very, very, very big things a year. And so at this point, to be honest, unless I'm like tinkering with something, in which case it's so extremely technical. It's actually relatively straightforward to know whether this person is the person that can do it. Unless it's that, they're just enormous bets. So like, the last big bet I made was this guy, Jimmy Donaldson, Mr. Beast, and so I was like, all right, Jimmy, we're just going to scale this business together in 2020. And we created this thing called Beast Industries, which is the parent corp of all things Beast. But that can absorb hundreds of millions of dollars of my capital. So it's like a really straightforward way of just like letting it rip. Otherwise, on this stuff, it's purely about just this technical idea and whether it has legs. And there it's honestly, it's like when the person talks, you can tell whether they're capable of the problem. And then you're just, you're just supporting them more than anything else. Because I'm not technical enough to do it, but I'm technical enough to sniff out whether it's interesting enough and then just be a good support system for them.
Yeah, I will say again, like trying to break the veil of Chamath a little bit, like you're extreme, like the learning aspect of how you think through these things, like you probably are, like I said.
Dude, the largest investment I made in like 2021 or 2022 was into this energy business. Why did I do energy? It was so stupid. It was like at the time, I don't do this anymore because I have my own team that does it, but at the time, Gates mentioned that he pays McKinsey to teach him about stuff. And I was like, well, fuck, I'm going to hire McKinsey. So I called this guy at McKinsey, the same guy who now works at Google, actually, this guy, James Manika. And I was like, James, can you teach me? I want to understand everything about energy. Because while we were baking the chip, I was like, wow, the biggest constraint is energy. The biggest. So I was like, I need to understand it all. All forms of generation, all forms of storage. I need to understand all of it. It cost me $3 million. But these fucking McKinsey consultants show up for a whole summer. Hours and hours and hours, and they did a big teach-in. Fabulous. And that was the impetus for me to like dip my toe in and like start this. But yeah, I love these learning processes. They're the best because it's like I don't know, it's like a puzzle. And you're like, oh, what are you going to find around the corner? Sometimes you find nothing and you get decapitated and you lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Other times you just tag it and it works and it's like super fun.
I'll tell you, before we get to questions from the audience, which we will have right after this, my favorite McKinsey story is the Jerry Seinfeld McKinsey. Have you heard of this?
No.
So Seinfeld is a interview in Harvard Business Review, and he's talking about doing Seinfeld and why'd you leave at the top of your game? And he's like, well, it was so hard. Me and Larry David every week we had to rehearse and get everything. They go, why don't you hire McKinsey to figure out the workflow, and you guys just work on this part? And he's like, who's McKinsey? It's like, oh, they're a consulting firm. He goes, are they funny? And he's like, no. He's like, the hard way is the right way.
Totally.
And you're clearly doing it the hard way. So that's some questions for the audience. Who wants to go first? Oh, there's one right there.
Thank you. Chamath, what's something that you've changed your mind about recently?
There was a period where I was very, very, very negative on biotech. And the reason I was negative was it just seemed like we're at a point in the cycle where the best biotech company is actually going to be baked in software and silicon. And so I thought the returns and the investment and just the risk just didn't make sense. And the reason why that was important to me is my wife runs a biotech company. So I was always I've always paid attention to it to try to be helpful to her, just as a secondary or tertiary point of view as she runs her business. But I've completely changed my mind on that. I'm very excited about where we are. And the reason is I think that there's now so much openness to software basically taking out an enormous amount of cost and complexity that I think you're going to see an order of magnitude reduction in the time. So instead of 13 years, let's call it 2 or 3 years, and capital instead of $2 billion down to probably about $200 million to get something to market. What that means is I think you're going to 100x the number of things that will be available. And so I suspect where it's going to start is a lot of stuff that's a little bit more superficial. I'll give you an example. There's a specific gene that, for example, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump have, which allow them to sleep 4 hours. That gene has been isolated. And there's a trial going on right now at UCSF where you can actually genetically modify yourself with that gene so that you can just be a 4-hour sleeper. And you would say, well, what's the value of 4 hours of sleep? It turns out that you sleep 20 years of your life. But that's assuming you sleep 8 hours. If you cut it down to 4, you live an extra 10 years. You're awake 10 extra years. And so there's all these people that are going to go after that. Now, that's at one end of the spectrum of what I would call something that's a little bit more superficial. But there was this thing in islets that was announced. I don't know if anybody of you have type 1 diabetes or know somebody with type 1 diabetes, but there was a longitudinal trial of a therapy that basically cured 9 out of 12 people for the last year. So now I'm all the way pendulum back to this other thing. The reason why these things are important to me is maybe taking a step back. What I would really like to do, I think my goal at this point is there are a few people in the United States who can cross over enough to kind of marry a little bit of politics, a little bit of tech, and a little bit of capital and finance to do important things. And I would like to eventually be one of those people. And I think the best way to allocate your time is to focus on American supremacy. And the reason I say that is that I think the world has been generally much better off when America is in charge. Meaning, America has had always, at least in this last 50-year cycle, technological supremacy. And from it has come military and economic supremacy. I think the world is more complicated, for example, if China surpasses the United States and has technological supremacy, from which it derives military and economic supremacy. And each of these transitions of that global world order is complicated. It's generally marked and punctuated by strife, by chaos, and war. So I would like to be on the front lines of that journey in maintaining American supremacy. Everybody can win. There's way more than enough to go around, but it maintains order. there are a handful of things that are required to maintain that order. And so I'm in these pockets. So it was very worrisome to me that in one of the pockets where I was spending a lot of time learning, I had written off and I thought, oh, we've lost it. This is not possible. There's no capital efficient way. What did he call it today? Enlightened self-interest. There was no enlightened self-interest that was possible in biotech, but now it's back. And so I kind of changed my mind and I'm like relearning things and I'm trying to get back up to speed quickly. But my mind has been decayed for a year on the topic because I just wrote it off and I said, oh, fuck it. It's not worth focusing on. Sorry, long-winded answer, but that's an example.
All right, while we go to the next question, I'm going to answer the same question. One of the things that we saw here that I changed my mind on was the growth of AI copilots at Shopify has grown more in non-R&D roles than in R&D roles. So for example, sales, finance, support.
I believe that.
These folks are using Cursor to build shit that they now can self-serve.
That's fantastic.
And so we're seeing Cursor growth outside of R&D.
I mean, look, the primary programming language is English. All this other stuff are unnecessary abstractions. They create inefficiency, and eventually won't even be English. It'll be cognitive thought. But until we get to cognitive thought, I think English is the programming language. And so that makes a lot of sense that people who can speak English, i.e., the people that don't have to interpret English through a layer of abstraction.
Exactly.
It's just like, that just makes a ton of sense to me.
It's amazing. All right, next question.
A quick question. You've talked about the seamless integration between the model and the application layer and also at the inference layer. So what do you think in the next 5 years would be, where's the biggest opportunity in these 3 layers, and still do we need a seamless integration between the three to prevail?
Okay, well look, if you think about what happened, I think that the really genius thing that NVIDIA did was invent CUDA. It's not even the chip. And the reason is that it allowed things like PyTorch to abstract for a lot of these people who weren't technical enough to write compiled code, but to write, Python. That was a very smart move. And all these compilations basically allowed you to believe that you had a dedicated chip team at your company. And so if you think about what has effectively happened in pre-training is you've had a very tight coupling between all the attention frameworks and NVIDIA silicon via CUDA. Okay, fine. In inference, that's not true at all. And I don't think we have any idea what inference will look like, especially at scale. We're still searching in many ways, quite honestly, for the killer apps that drive output tokens. We haven't seen that yet. I tend to think like there's going to be a whole bunch of things in physical AI that will do more in the short term, but that's a longer thing. So where is the real opportunity? I think the opportunity is to recognize that models, these big foundational models, are a little bit overkill for many things. So the models will get more precise and smaller. That it's easier and easier to tape out custom silicon that's tied very deeply to what the model needs from memory perspective and otherwise. And then that you can basically actually write a functional compiler and write directly to the silicon and extract really great performance. Be thoughtful about power. That cycle is just starting. This idea that you have this generic compute layer made by a company is idiotic, I think. I just think that's not realistic. I don't think you can support a multi-deca-trillion-dollar economy that way with 1 or 2 monopoly businesses. So I think we're going to go and rebuild the stack. And that's super exciting. That's super, super exciting to me. That's a huge, that's a big one. That's a really big one.
All right, let's go to the next question.
Hey, Chamath. I sent this to you in an email, but I thought might as well ask you right now. Earlier today, you were talking to Toby, and you mentioned that if you were back in your 20s, you would spend more time learning about development, kind of getting into it more than kind of pushing it away. And just now you mentioned that English is becoming like the language for interacting with technology. So maybe instead of asking if you knew how to code or do all that, what would you be focusing on now? Maybe the question is, if you had more time, because you obviously know English, what are some of the things that you'll be tinkering with and building?
So the reason I say both of those things is for my job, I need to understand a level of detail, and right now I struggle to keep up with that level of detail. I was telling the story, one of the best things that I've had the privilege of doing is, like, Elon will let me audit meetings. I audited 2 meetings 2 or 3 Tuesdays ago. And the first meeting was with Dojo. That I can handle myself, because that's like silicon, I get it. But then the second meeting was with Optimus, and man, totally over my head. And it was just the ARM. It was just like talking about the articulation, all this. It was way over my head. So I leave tilted. And I go home and I call my wife and I'm like, I'm so fucking annoyed. It's like I'm Googling shit in the middle of the meeting, trying to not feel stupid. So for me, I wish that I had that capacity that he has. I don't have that capacity, so I just have to work a lot harder. And part of it is when I go all the way back to my 20s, I took myself off a technical trajectory, I think, from me, for what I do, too early. But that's not all people. For most people, what I would say is perfecting the use of these tools is the equivalent of learning how to farm with a tractor when you're competing against farmers with a, horse. Does that make sense? This tool is so powerful, and you have to understand how to harness the tool. Like, here's a different example of this. Have you ever studied the Upper Paleolithic era? Have you ever studied that?
You mean in school?
Yeah, it's really fucking cool. It's like, how did Homo sapiens win and how did Neanderthals not win, right? There was this divergence. And one of the things was tool design and the implementation of tools. And in the tools, the biggest decision between Neanderthals and humans was that we perfected distance armament versus up close, right? And so, if you had to fight Neanderthals, were like, oh, let me go and fight the bear right in his face. Obviously, like, you just have a higher death rate. Over here, we're like, oh, we invented the bow and arrow, we invented lightweight spears, we invented all these things, and we perfected tools, and we were capable of using those tools. So, does it matter that you invented it? No. I think it's matter that you figure out how to adopt it. So, if I were not me, I would be living and breathing how these tools can re-architect your job. I think that's a really powerful thing to do. But for me personally, I feel in a lot of situations, I just feel not technical enough, and I'm scrambling to keep up, kind of a thing. So, anyways.
It is still very valuable to learn how to code, to understand how these things work, to understand what's happening 3 or 4 layers below the layer that you are working at.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, that's true. And but look, understanding how to write code, go through a compile, get to a chip, that is probably something that any engineer should know. I bet you most engineers have no clue, which is a little bit embarrassing, I think. But they should know. Yep. That's the worst part and the best part about these abstracted languages.
Right, I was telling you about my son. We vibe code on the weekends, and then he's like, he doesn't like it because he wants to see the code. I'm like, that's a good instinct.
Yeah.
You want to be able to understand it. I want to say thank you to Chamath and everybody here. That was amazing, as usual.
Thanks. Nice to see you.
Yes. Always fun to hang out. Take it easy.